What did it take for the United States to evolve from a young republic towards a modern democracy, headed for war by 1848? To answer this, we need to explore the years between 1800 and 1848, a time when political, cultural, and economic transformations reshaped the nation and the lives of everyday Americans. Along the way, debates over democracy, expansion, and identity would challenge the nation's unity and its very definition of freedom. In 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson marked the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties, from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. This shift signaled a new direction, with Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic of independent farmers and a limited federal government. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, had championed a strong national government and a robust industrial economy. By contrast, Jefferson's approach emphasized states' rights in a more decentralized system. Jefferson's victory also represented the triumph of a democratic process, despite the fact that voting was still limited to property owning white men. This peaceful transition solidified the country's commitment to democracy, even if that democracy was still incomplete. The early 19th century saw the nation's political landscape evolve dramatically. Over the next few decades, states began changing their laws to expand suffrage, or voting. By the 1820s, states like New York and Massachusetts allowed all adult white men to vote, regardless of property ownership. This shift made elections more democratic and led to the rise of political parties. The Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, emerged as the voice of the common man, while the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, advocated for a strong national government, internal improvements, and a protective tariff. The 1828 election of Andrew Jackson symbolized the rise of the common man, or the regular guy. Jackson, a war hero from the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, represented the new, expanded electorate of non-property owning white men. Jackson's presidency emphasized greater participation in government, challenging established elites and focusing on the ideals of Jacksonian democracy, which promoted universal white male suffrage and opposed the concentration of power in the central government. Jackson's spoils system rewarded his political supporters with government jobs, solidifying his political base. His policies also started bitter opposition, including the nullification crisis in South Carolina, where states' rights advocates, including the vice president, his ex-best friend, challenged federal tariff laws. Jackson's response, which involved military force to assert federal authority, exemplified the tensions between federal and state power that would continue throughout American history. Jackson's influence reached beyond political structures. His policies, such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, forced Native American tribes from their ancestral lands, starting fierce resistance. Despite legal challenges, the U.S. government relocated thousands of Native Americans to reservations in the Trail of Tears, demonstrating the brutal costs of expansion and the disregard for Native sovereignty. While Jacksonian democracy transformed the political landscape, the country's social framework was also undergoing significant change. In the early 1800s, the Second Great Awakening swept across the nation, igniting a religious revival that called for personal salvation and societal reform. Preachers like Charles Grandison Finney held revivals that drew thousands, promoting the idea of individual responsibility and moral improvement. As the movement spread, it inspired many Americans to take action outside of governmental institutions to address social issues. Abolitionist groups, led by figures like William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the newspaper The Liberator, pushed for the immediate emancipation of enslaved people. Garrison's calls for abolition drew attention to the moral contradictions of slavery in a nation that prided itself on liberty and equality. The Second Great Awakening also spurred the women's rights movement. Leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, demanding equal rights for women, including the right to vote. These reforms were linked to broader changes in family and gender roles, as industrialization altered the traditional structure of American society. Women became more involved in public life, particularly in social reforms like the Temperance movement, which sought to reduce alcohol consumption and improve public morals. At the same time, technological innovations were reshaping the nation's economy. The market revolution, which unfolded over the course of the 1800s, brought major changes to agriculture, industry, and commerce. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1793, revolutionized cotton production in the South, making cotton more profitable and increasing the demand for enslaved labor. As cotton became the South's cash crop, the institution of slavery expanded, creating a deepening divide between the North and South over the issue of slavery in new territories. In the North, the Industrial Revolution spurred the rise of factories, particularly in cities like Lowell, Massachusetts, where women worked in textile mills. These factories, powered by innovations like the steam engine, marked a shift from the old home-based economy to one of wage labor and mass production. The expansion of railroads and the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 connected the agricultural South to northern markets, facilitating trade and fueling economic growth. As new industries grew, the United States moved towards becoming an interconnected national economy. Technological innovations didn't just change industry, they also transformed transportation and communication. The construction of canals, railroads, and the development of the telegraph revolutionized the speed of communication and transportation, reducing the costs of goods and encouraging westward migration. The Erie Canal and the growth of railroads were crucial in linking the North and the Midwest with the South, opening new markets and speeding up the movement of goods. The expansion of the United States during this time was not solely economic. It was driven by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that it was America's divine mission to expand westward. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had already doubled the country's size, acquiring vast lands from France. The Lewis and Clark expedition from 1804 to 1806 mapped these territories, establishing relations with Native American tribes and opening up new lands for settlement. The promise of fertile land in the West attracted settlers, but it also fueled conflict over the future of slavery in the new territories. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, embodied this spirit of manifest destiny. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded large portions of land, including modern-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, to the United States. This new land fueled debates over whether slavery would be allowed to spread into these territories. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846 proposed banning slavery in the territories gained from Mexico, which deepened sectional tensions between the North and South. As I said before, the expansion of U.S. territory through purchase and conquest meant the forced relocation of Native American tribes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Jackson, led to the forced migration of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southeast to lands west of the Mississippi River, known as the Trail of Tears. The relocation caused two sets of suffering, with many Native Americans dying during the long journey west to Oklahoma Territory, which displaced and challenged local tribes in turn. As the United States expanded, questions arose about the role of slavery in the new territories. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, but the acquisition of new lands started new debates. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to address the issue of slavery, allowing for popular sovereignty in territories like Kansas and Nebraska, letting the residents decide whether to allow slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 led to violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in Bleeding, Kansas, further deepening the rift between North and South. As territorial expansion, industrialization, and reforms reshaped the United States, cultural divides also began to deepen. The North and South developed distinct identities. One focused on manufacturing and wage labor, the other on agricultural production and slavery. The rise of abolitionism fueled this divide. By the 1830s, figures like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth began to speak out against slavery in more powerful ways. Abolitionists like Grandison called for the immediate end to slavery, and Douglass used his own story as a former slave to advocate for freedom. The abolitionist movement gained momentum through underground railroads and speeches that exposed the brutal realities of slavery, challenging the nation's moral conscience. As this happened, women's rights advocates like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton fought for equality and suffrage. By the time of the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, these women had launched a movement for women's right to vote, setting the stage for the suffrage movement in the decades to come, though they backed down to push abolition of slavery first. By 1848, the United States was a nation at a crossroads. It had expanded across the continent, developed new industries, and deepened its commitment to democratic ideals. But those ideals were challenged by the continued existence of slavery, the question of territorial expansion, and the demand for rights by groups that had been excluded from full participation in society. The debates and struggles of the period set the stage for the Civil War.